My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, and we are very pleased to be sponsoring a conversation with several of the country's preeminent experts on and most influential voices concerning the coronavirus and its implications for our country, for our relationship with the source of this virus, Communist China, the Chinese Communist Party that has inflicted it upon the rest of the world, including, of course, the United States, and also on what we should be doing now to try to both counter this disease, this pandemic, and to ensure that we survive the free republic and the values that it holds dear for the future, for our posterity, in the face of the present crisis and what may yet come from it. To join us to discuss this, as I mentioned, we will have some members of the Committee on the Present Danger China, some other good friends and colleagues who have been instrumental in the work of the committee, but who are officially not part of it. And I'm going to be introducing them in turn in just a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to say a brief word about the committee, its mission, its historical antecedents, and what we hope to do in the course of today's conversation. The Committee on the Present Danger has had several different incarnations over the years. Perhaps its most illustrious was during the 1970s, when a group of national security practitioners, people who are subject matter experts, business leaders, religious freedom and human rights activists and the like, came together to try to help one of their members, a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan, devise and socialize and ultimately obtain a mandate to assure that we had an effective strategy against that era's existential threat to freedom, namely the Soviet communist regime, then running the evil empire, as Ronald Reagan famously called it. The efforts of the Committee on the Present Danger during that period, I think, were instrumental to both the election of President Reagan and his successful execution of the strategy they helped devise. The rest, as they say, is history. Inspired by that experience, a new group of similar skilled individuals has come together to try to help contend with our time's existential threat to freedom. It is not a partisan group. We are seeking to advance policies that will help our country contend with the Chinese Communist Party, what it's up to, its ambitions, and the present and growing danger that they represent to all of us. This particular event, our first virtual threat briefing, if you will, is one of a series that we have now executed going back to March of 2019 for the purpose of raising awareness among the American people about the challenges that we're facing from China. They seem to be fairly obvious to us all in the wake of this coronavirus epidemic, but we're not so clear in the months that have preceded it. And we have been seriously pursuing not just heightened awareness, but also engagement on the part of the American people in this election season, most especially in the choice that we have to make in terms of, will we finally recognize and contend effectively with the challenge posed by Xi Jinping and his colleagues in the Chinese Communist Party, who seek unmistakably and now increasingly avowedly to displace this country as the world's dominant power, and do so perhaps with great harm to us, to our, as I say, Constitution and freedoms, and to our people. That seems to be pretty obviously the case at the moment when you look at what the coronavirus has been inflicting upon, most obviously and initially, the people of China, but now people all over the world, and what it is doing to our society here at home. But we believe that it needs to be understood both in the immediate context and more broadly as indeed, Ronald Reagan's famous phrase, an existential threat to freedom. To discuss all of this, I'm very pleased to have with us several really valued colleagues and comrades in arms, if you will. We're going to hear first from Dr. Sean Lin. He is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. He is a survivor of the Tiananmen Square massacre during his time in China. And since he left, he has been a prominent figure in certainly the work of this committee in bringing to light insights into what China is about, what it does to its own people, and what it aspires to do to the rest of us, in part informed by his experience as a practitioner of Falun Gong, a very, very harshly persecuted minority in China, its practitioners. He is also, by training, a PhD in microbiology, who served in the United States Army and completed his 9 years of service in the Army as the director of a viral disease laboratory at Walter Reed. We've asked Dr. Lin to share with us his insights with the experience of a trained microbiologist, specialist in viral diseases, to sort of give us a sense of what this disease is about, what it is likely to do in a nation like ours, and how best to counter it. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Sean Lin to this virtual threat briefing of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Dr. Lin, over to you.
A very important threat briefing because, as we know, in the last couple of weeks, there was a lot of debate because the Chinese government has been pushing out a big smearing campaign, blaming the U.S. was the source of the virus outbreak, and even blaming U.S. military spreading the virus to Wuhan when the U.S. had a delegation to join in the military competitions. Sports competitions in Wuhan last year. So I think this is really actually pissed off a lot of people in the military service. And I think it's a good time let's look at what exactly happened in China in December and January, what Chinese government did and what happened in China regarding this outbreak. So we can now have more insights, know what's happening based on many of the media report and also on social media from Chinese press. So we can see now the first case can actually be traced back to December 1st. And this was actually based on a Lancet report by a Chinese doctor, Huan Chaoling, from the Wuhan Jintang Hospital, which is the main hospital that's treating these patients infected with novel coronavirus. And then on December 8th and 10th, 4 more cases already being hospitalized, and only one case actually associated with the Huanan seafood market. And then throughout December, more and more patients turn out hospitalized in different hospitals in Wuhan. And actually, some of the samples already being shipped to sequencing company to conduct pathogen discovery. And then by December 26th, the Guangzhou Weiyuan Genomic Company has already obtained a full viral sequence and has already reported to the Wuhan CDC as well. And they mentioned they identify a SARS-like virus with 81% homology. So this clearly is a SARS-like virus. And then the Jintang Hospital also conducted many tests to confirm this is a SARS-like virus with additional sampling from the different patients. So this is actually already confirmed by December 30. This is a SARS-like virus, a novel coronavirus. But however, on December 30th, the Wuhan Public Health Commission, when they issued the public alert, they still saying this is an unknown pneumonia, right? And then on December 31st, the Wuhan police actually announced their punishment for the 8 doctors who talk about this identification of novel coronavirus on their own social chatting rooms on the WeChat. And Dr. Li Wenliang was one of them. And this is actually already, when the Public Health Commission already know this is a novel coronavirus. So on January 1st, BGI, one of the biggest genomic sequencing company in China, also obtained the full genome sequence and then submitted to the Chinese CDC. So it's very clear on January 1st, the Chinese authority know this is a novel coronavirus, but they still tell the public this is an unknown pneumonia, and they still punish those doctors who try to tell their colleagues about this outbreak of the novel coronavirus in Wuhan. And also including Dr. Ivan from Wuhan Central Hospital. She's the one actually sharing those CT images to her colleagues, telling about this is a novel coronavirus or SARS-like patients. So all of them got criticized and they got silenced. And so you can see Chinese government already wasted the whole month of December in response to this outbreak. And then on January, and the local government still did not take any active measures to prevent the disease outbreak. And even on January 17th and 18th, the Wuhan's local governments still organize big community events, and one of the events have more than 40,000 households with more than 100,000 people engaged. And this is actually when the Chinese CDC already announced their highest level alert on January 15. So it's really hard to imagine that the local authorities in Wuhan can have such high level of malfeasance in handling this disease. And also, we know the Wuhan CDC has also done a terrible job in the initial response to this outbreak. So far, we have not seen any report about the testing results for any animal sample might be collected in the Wuhan area or whether in the Huanan seafood market or not. But there's no report on any testing results for animal samples. So far, the whole world still don't know what would be the real animal reservoirs, and also no idea who may be the patient zero. The Chinese government still owed the whole of these key questions. And these are very important in terms of epidemiology. So what might be the animal host, what might be the intermediate animal host, because even if the wave of the epidemic passed away, the whole world still need to be alert what might be the animal host, what might still spreading the virus as through this intermediate animal host. So this is really, really important question, but the Chinese government still owe the whole world about these questions. And also, I think the terrible failure of the Wuhan CDCs and Chinese Public Health Commissions on identifying the patient zero and also the animal reservoir really should be held accountable, and also especially need to be held accountable when they're covering up the information and let the Chinese society missing a very golden about 1 to 2 months period to contain this outbreak. And we know there's a recent report on it's a preprint by the University of Southampton from United Kingdom. And this report is actually joined publication by many scientists from UK, from China, from the United States too. And this report clearly predicted if this outbreak can be handled by non-pharmaceutical inventions, through different measures like social distancing, even just 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks earlier, the total case of infected in China could be dramatic difference. The number can be reduced to like 66% reduction, 86% reduction, or 95% reduction respectively, if the Chinese government can really be transparent and handle it with non-pharmaceutical invention 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks earlier. So this is clearly telling us the Chinese government is really the culprit for the outbreak that's spreading whole world to become a pandemic, they need to be held accountable. And so this is a clear scientific, suggestion that the Chinese government did a terrible job carrying out, the situations. And right now they even try to shift the blame to the United States. And I think the whole world is actually paying the price for these Chinese government's malfeasance and also their corruption. They're covering up the informations. And so this is very, very sad situation. One government's terrible mistake and the whole world have to suffer. And at the same time, we also need to ask about Chinese governments to have transparency regarding about their gain of function studies in their virology lab in Wuhan. Because the Wuhan Institute of Virology definitely have the capacity to conduct many of the gain of function studies, even based on the previous publication. For example, they already put a bad coronavirus S protein on a mouse adapted to human SARS coronavirus backbone. And the resulting viral mutants was actually, to their own surprise, gaining pathogenicities in the mouse models too. And I saw other reports saying these groups of scientists in the Wuhan Institute of Virology may already conduct studies on the rhesus macaque on some of the gain of function studies. But because maybe related to the military projects, and it's very hard to find out additional detail. So I think the Chinese government still also owing the world another explanation whether or not they have military projects already pushing on the gain of function study on coronavirus or other dangerous pathogens like Ebola virus. And the Chinese government signed up the Biological Weapon Convention on 1984, but do they really comply with this convention? So these another questions the Chinese government need to answer to the whole world, because it's really a fundamental bioethical issue, and the Chinese government's experiment on this front may put the whole humanity in danger as well. So I think this is really an important question as well. So overall, I feel right now, we saw that President Trump has been insisting calling the outbreak China virus and also Chinese virus, and the Secretary Pompeo called this Wuhan virus. I think this is also a accurate description, because it described where the outbreak started, where it originated. And this is a common way in the scientific world as well, to naming the disease based on where it originated. And at the same time, I think it could be even more accurate to call it CCP virus as well, because it's the Chinese Communist Party's force to let the whole virus spread into the whole world. And it's like the CCP's curse on the whole world. So I think it could be even more accurate to call it CCP virus as well.
Dr. Lin, thank you very much. Point very well taken, and thank you for giving us sort of the epidemiological sort of background to this trauma that we're now facing, and the need to understand both its extent, its implications, and of course, to begin getting our hands around what we need to do about it. This is extremely useful. I want to turn next to Rosemary Gibson, another member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, who, to her great credit, put her extraordinary and indeed award-winning skills as a medical writer to the task of raising a warning in our country, and worldwide for that matter, about the dangerous dependency that we have on communist China for medicines. About 2 years ago, when she published a book with a co-author by the name of China RX, which really details the dangerous vulnerability of this country and others to this reliance on China for a host of medicines and the ingredients of those that they don't manufacture in their entirety, both for generic purposes and others. Rosemary Gibson is a very, very esteemed colleague, and we're delighted to have her with us to talk a little bit about what the implications are of this dependency in the wake of this pandemic now, and what we have to do to try to rectify our present vulnerability and get ourselves onto a sounder footing in terms of being able to defend against such diseases as this coronavirus, or the CCP virus, if you will. Rosemary Gibson, welcome to this virtual threat
Frank,
briefing.
thank you for the opportunity to be here today. 2 years ago in China RX, we wrote that in the event of a natural disaster or global pandemic, if China shut the door on exports of essential medicines, the United States will be waiting in line with other countries around the world for essential medicines. And that's exactly where we are today. As many of you know, China has withheld masks and other medical supplies from the United States and other countries. We have a perfect storm of a production shutdown in China. Transportation routes and deliveries are held up. And China has commandeered medical supplies meant for export to the US and other countries to use for its own people. So we have the perfect storm of a production shutdown, a disease outbreak in China that has spread around the world, and the global supply of the core chemicals for our medicines, 80% of them come from China. So what was predicted in China RX, this is what we're seeing right now. So what does it mean for day-to-day implications for our country? We've heard a lot about masks and respirators and protective gowns. That production is ramping up here in the United States. Fortunately, before a disease outbreak goes to a larger scale, if it indeed does do that, it will take more time for the United States to build up capacity to actually produce critical drugs. To give you an idea of what we're talking about, if there are people who are hospitalized with coronavirus, those would be very seriously ill people, most of them. And fortunately, it's a small number, but they will need basic critical medicines to be cared for. Again, these are not treatments to cure, but they're medicines to care for people. They're sedatives if you have to be on a ventilator. They're medicines to keep your blood pressure up. And if chances are good that people will get a secondary infection such as pneumonia or sepsis because their immune systems are weakened. And we depend on China for virtually all of the antibiotics to treat those infections. This has been true in the best of times without coronavirus, and certainly now it's true when the demand could escalate. So if there's any silver lining in the coronavirus situation, it is that we are finally highlighting this extraordinary vulnerability on a single country, the world's vulnerability on a single country for essential commodities that are necessary for life itself. Since then, we are seeing movement in Congress with members of both parties that are drafting legislation. Most recently, I saw a draft bill that it looks very, very promising that can help jumpstart production here in the United States quickly. We have tremendous talent here. We've had hundreds of thousands of pharmaceutical engineers and chemists laid off because of our outsourcing to China. And we have the opportunity to take advantage of that tremendous human capital here and put them back to work for our national health security and our national security. I want to address 2 points that to dispel some doubt that may still exist out there about the role for government in so far as bringing our medicine making back home. There's a perception out there that among some that the free market will fix this. To be clear, there is no free market in this market for generic drugs, which are 90% of the medicines we take. Western companies are collapsing. The last US headquartered plant, the $9 billion company, announced it was merging with another firm last year. 2 other Western generic drug makers, Sandoz and Teva. European and Israeli. They announced last year that they're dropping half their products because they cannot make ends meet. Their margins are just too slim. And meanwhile, we're seeing China ramp up production of generic drugs. They account now for 10% of our generic drugs. In just 10 years, they achieved that market share. And soon it'll be 20%, 30%, 40%. India supplies 25% of our generic drugs, but they depend on China for nearly 70% of the core chemicals to make them. So the message is all roads lead to China. And I think it's just a matter of time before China overtakes India in production of our essential medicines, because they have the industrial policy resources that they're putting behind it. And bear in mind that Western companies are competing not against Chinese companies, they're competing against the Chinese government, because those domestic companies are flush with cash as the government seeks to become the pharmacy to the world. I also want to underscore another point out that's raised out there. Well, we should let the private sector do this and government shouldn't get involved. Again, if you're a Western company and you want to set up a manufacturing plant here in the United States right now, we'll have a situation where Chinese companies can come in and undercut them on price and drive them out of business. This is how we lost our ability to make penicillin, basic things like aspirin. We cannot make aspirin here in the United States, let alone critical antibiotics. So the private sector can't do it alone and go up against, effectively, the Chinese government. Recently, the president announced that it's going to use the Defense Production Act as a vehicle to spur domestic manufacturing. The White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy says will be coming out with an executive order, which the president personally asked them to do, that will include Buy American provisions, and it will also support innovation and manufacturing technology, which will help us make critical drugs here in the United States faster, cheaper, real-time quality control, and with a smaller environmental footprint. We have tremendous ingenuity in our country, and now's the time that we can ensure our health security, because this is going to happen again. There'll be another coronavirus at some point in the future. And at that time, China will have even a tighter grip. Right now, China controls the ingredients for thousands of medicines that we need to run our healthcare systems. And the quality has been exceedingly concerning. Some of you might remember the blood pressure medicine recalls, because a Chinese company that was a global producer had highest levels of carcinogens, 200 times the acceptable limit of carcinogens in the blood pressure pills that Americans and people around the world were taking. So we have to find a different path here. We have a strategic direction and a strategic choice to make. Do we want to continue on the same path, or do we want to pursue a strategy where we can have a minimum level of capacity to make our own critical medicines at a time like this? I also want to underscore, and I was looking for a quote here that was in the Chinese state-run media about the threat that China recently posed to the United States. I'll read it to you. If China retaliates against the US at this time, in addition to announcing a travel ban on the US, it will also announce control over medicine production and ban exports to the United States. If China announces its drugs are for domestic use and bans exports, the US will fall into the hell of a new coronavirus epidemic. So we have been warned. We have the opportunity to take this warning and motivate us to bring production back to the United States so we are not subject to the leverage that China holds over us currently. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Rosemary Gibson, thank you. Extremely provocative, but also very important warnings you've been sounding, again, to your great credit, for some 2 years. And I think it's just a testament in part to your doggedness in making the case, as well as, of course, the developments of late, that we're seeing action taken very much along the lines that you have been calling for now in the Congress as well as the executive branch. And hats off to you, and thank you for joining us to talk about this today. Next, we're going to hear from Gordon Chang, one of the country's preeminent experts on China, and particularly on the relationship between the United States and China. Gordon is the author, among other books, of The Coming Collapse of China. He's thought long and hard about the policy of engagement that has been pursued by successive US governments and businesses and the financial markets for decades now. He too has been sounding, I think, the clarion warnings about these policies of engagement and the real dangers that are associated with them. I fear that many of those warnings were not heeded before now, but they're certainly in need of a very fresh and earnest attention on the part of both government and our population more generally. And Gordon, I appreciate so much you joining us to talk a bit about how you see what has happened to date with the coronavirus, the sorts of involvement of the Chinese Communist Party that Sean talked about, and the kinds of implications for our public health as well as national security that this sort of microcosm of the supply chain dependencies that Rosemary has discussed so clearly in connection with this medicine situation, where we are now, in short, and where we need to go from here, as you see it, with respect to the policy of engagement specifically and our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party more generally. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Frank, and thank you to the committee for including me. In recent weeks, the Communist Party of China has revealed much about itself, and we're going to start on Tuesday, because on Tuesday, China attacked the dollar. The Global Times, which is controlled by People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, said that Beijing might start dumping US treasuries. We got to understand that dumping the treasuries, attacking the dollar, is an attack on the US financial system, of course, and an attack on the US financial system is an attack on the global system. Unfortunately, this was not isolated, because yesterday, Global Times again started to warn the world about a depression in the United States. Well, a depression in the United States is a depression in the world, and a depression in the world, of course, is a depression in China itself, because China has an export-dependent economy. And of course, China is dependent on capital flows. In other words, it's dependent on countries like the US investing in China, because China doesn't have a sustainable model. It continually needs money from the outside. Now, in a sense, maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that China is trying to collapse the American economy. But this is a China that wants to take over the world. And to take over the world, the last thing it should be doing is attacking us because of its dependence on everything. So we should remember what China is doing. And to do this, I think that we need to see China's plight. And to see China's plight, we should look at the Chinese economy. China's economy in the January to February period was obviously in contraction. This is important because January and February constitutes about 60% of the first quarter of China's output. People are saying, well, China's economy fell 13% in the January-February period. And that's aggregated because of the shifting Lunar New Year, and that causes distortions in the numbers. So generally these 2 months are aggregated. So people are saying, oh, it fell about 13%. Well, that looks a little bit light when we look at the underlying indicators, probably fell somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. We know, or we can suspect, that there's some recovery in the Chinese economy in March. They're saying that about 70% of China's workers are now back at their job sites. That sounds a little bit high, but could be correct. But we do know that China right now is in a very stressful situation. Now, to highlight China's plight is important because China cannot recover without strong demand from the world, and especially strong demand from American consumers and businesses. So what's occurring right now is China is doing something which is directly undermining its own interests. And when national leaders undermine their own interests by attacking the United States, which makes it impossible for their own economy to recover, we've got to be concerned that something is very wrong at the heart of the Chinese political system. Over the last month and a half or so, we've seen senior figures in Beijing criticize openly, publicly, in very sharp terms, leader Xi Jinping. And that is an indication that there is dissension at the top of the Communist Party. There's a number of things that could be happening. Our friend Arthur Waldron, the great China historian at the University of Pennsylvania, says, look, China's communist experiment is just about at an end. There's no further place for them to go. And he talks about this process of disintegration which we saw with regard to the Soviet Union in the last half decade. You know, we don't know when China's economy will fail, when the Chinese political system will fail, but we can see important things that are occurring right now in Beijing. And one of them is that apparently the party has lost much of the support of the Chinese people. We know this because with the death of Dr. Li Wenlong, which Sean talked about, he died on February 7th. He was one of the Wuhan 8 whistleblowers who tried to warn Wuhan and the rest of China about what was going on. When he died, there was white hot anger in the Chinese populace. You could see this across social media platforms. And unlike other earlier instances of Communist Party malfeasance, people in China started for the first time in a decade or so to actually talk about fundamental political reform. Because when his death was announced, people were starting to say, and the hashtag became popular across China, WeChat, and elsewhere, that we want fundamental reform. We want the right to speak. Also at that time, we heard the Chinese people start to adopt as their anthem the song, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" That's that politically impactful song from Les Miserables. It is the song that the people in Hong Kong adopted as a means of protesting China. So we can see that the Communist Party right now is at one of those junctures where it has lost support. So what is it trying to do to regain support? Well, unfortunately, it's lashing out at the US. As Sean talked about, there were a series of tweets from the Chinese Foreign Ministry in the most irresponsible terms. The Foreign Ministry, since about February 5 or February 6, has been on a campaign to tar the United States in connection with epidemics. But it really came to a crescendo on Thursday, because on Thursday, you had a Foreign Ministry spokesman call out US officials as quote unquote immoral. And just before that, that Foreign Ministry spokesman, as Sean said that patient zero was an American in America, and said that it looked like the virus, the coronavirus, was spread to Wuhan by the US Army. And the way this was put, it was intimating germ warfare. At the same time, we saw another Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. She then twisted the testimony of the head of the CDC, Robert Redfield, to show that the coronavirus was American in origin. And Frank and everyone, we've got to understand what the significance of this is, because on Friday, the following day, the State Department summoned the Chinese ambassador to the US to protest this highly dangerous disinformation campaign. But that didn't work, because this week, China's ambassador to South Africa has repeatedly tweeted out these conspiratorial theories, which are completely baseless. And all of this shows that China is doing a couple of things. We can sort of, as Americans, we sort of ignore Chinese propaganda, especially when it's ludicrous. But we got to remember that the Communist Party here is preparing and justifying in its own minds of the senior leaders the right to use force against the United States. And it's also trying to prepare the Chinese people for the use of such force. So, you know, this is exceedingly dangerous. Now, I don't think that China's going to lash out at the US, certainly not in the near future, but it could very well do so, because what it's doing is putting into place all the elements of conflict. Now, in this conflict, we've got to understand that this could be history's last great war. We see all these dangerous elements in place. We have to fear what's coming next. Let me just leave you with one point, and that is that in our disagreements and what we're seeing with China, we got to remember that we do have some important allies. And these important allies are China's most immediate victims. Of course, the Chinese people, the Tibetans, Uyghurs and Kazakhs, people in Taiwan, people in Hong Kong. These are people that we should be reaching out with, because China's challenge against us is an existential one. Xi Jinping believes that he's the world's only sovereign leader, that China's the world's only sovereign state. That reduces the United States and other countries to mere subjects. We have to understand the fundamental nature of this challenge, look for our allies, and be prepared to defend ourselves, as everyone has said recently.
Gordon, thank you. I appreciate so much you being with us. And again, this very sober message about the nature of the challenge that we're facing from China and the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party. It can't be said often enough. And I think particularly against the backdrop of what we're witnessing right now and the effects on our public health, most obviously, of course, but also our sort of economy and society is something that speaks to a potential takedown of the United States by China. And we have to be alive to that being the ultimate objective of the Chinese, even if it's not their intended purpose right at the moment. To talk a little bit about the American response to all of this and what has to be done to, well, hopefully assure the survival of our economy and more generally our republic. I'm very pleased to have the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy, with us. Brian is the past and very distinguished president of the Claremont Institute in California. He is these days the president and founder of the American Strategy Group. He writes brilliantly on these and many other subjects in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, and has been a terrific leader of our efforts to try to acquaint the American people with the present and growing danger from China and to give them specific, concrete ideas about what we might do to try to protect ourselves and our beloved country against this threat. Brian Kennedy, welcome. It's so good to have you with us.
Thank you, Frank. Great to be with you. And let me thank the team at the Center for Security Policy for organizing all this. It's very much appreciated. And thank you to Sean and Rosemary and Gordon for three, I thought, brilliant presentations about what is going on today. When Frank and I were talking about this, we were trying to strike a balance between alerting people to just how serious this coronavirus is and what our political and economic response should be to it, but also to look at this in a more positive light, because we Americans can figure anything out if we're asked to. The American people are some of the most hardworking and innovative people in the whole world. And when presented with a crisis like this, we can adjust and do the right thing, and in Rosemary's case, produce more medicines. In Gordon's case, look at the economic impacts and understand what is being done to the United States and what our response should be. And in Sean's case, simply to understand that this is the Chinese Communist Party doing what they do, which is to lie to their own people and to lie to the world. All that having been said, when we look around the country today, we've been engaged in this whole process of what's called flattening the curve, meaning shutting down the US economy so that the virus does not spread far and wide among our population and then overwhelm our healthcare system. Now, that seems perfectly sensible. And I would recommend, by the way, our colleague Steve Bannon has something called War Room Pandemic. It's on his website, War Room Pandemic, but also a podcast, and he's on radio around the country describing just how serious all this is. But one of the constant themes that Steve has had is that we simply have to flatten the curve so that large numbers of Americans don't get this. Now, the president has adopted that strategy. We're in the what's called containment mode. And that, I think, will buy us time so that the virus doesn't spread and overwhelm our healthcare system. My concern today is that we don't go too far with that. That I think we have substantially flattened the curve and educated Americans about what they ought to do, better hygiene, social distancing, engaging in common sense measures so that the virus doesn't spread. Early on, some people said, well, look, we don't want to shut things down because, we don't want to hurt the economy. Well, I and others said at the time, the economy exists for the good of the American people, not the other way around. The economy exists because the American people do things, but it exists for their benefit. Okay, fine. So we close down parts of the economy in order to stop the spread of the virus. But we need to be very careful now that we don't keep it closed for too long, because the American people will eventually need their economy back. We have millions of people who are going to be unemployed potentially if this goes on too long. And so we don't want 15 days to become 30 days, to become 60 days or 90 days. There's some talk in the media of shutting down the US economy for 120 days. Well, that would be a disaster. And that would be the kind of economic attack, I think, self-destruction the Chinese Communist Party would want for the United States. That we would shut down our economy that long will have disastrous economic and political ramifications for the country. Now, the good news is we don't need to shut it down for that long. We just simply need to engage in the kind of common sense, social distancing, and better hygiene, more aggressive hygiene than we have in the past. As we do this, we're going to be approaching summer. It's going to warm up. It will naturally slow down the spread of the virus. Over time, the United States right now is developing better therapeutic drugs to deal with the virus so that when you do catch it, it doesn't become as severe. Over time, we'll develop a vaccine, but that could take another year and a half. But ultimately, the American people, or not ultimately, but here just in the short run, the American people are going to need their economy back. They're going to need to get working again. They're going to need to be going to their places of worship. They're going to need to get back into an economy that they have built and which has been brilliant for the past 3 years. And so my great takeaway from all this is let's take it seriously, but let's also remember that we can adapt and innovate, and we can produce the medicines, we can produce the respirators, we can do all this in such a way that we can live through this crisis, and we should not let anything stop us from being the free and prosperous people that we are. Be smart, don't let the virus spread, be very careful, but also let's be aggressive with our adaptation to this new reality, and let's get Americans back to work as soon as is reasonably possible. I'm not saying tomorrow, but we should have the default view that Americans need to get back to work for their sake and for the sake of the country. So I would say, Frank, that's the message I would like to offer, and I would encourage everyone to look at the committee's website, presentdangerchina.org, and learn more about the kind of work that the committee has done.
Brian, thank you. Very important, I think, complement to our threat assessment is this prescription for how to proceed. And I just wanted to open up a conversation with the four of you about several of the things that we've touched on here and that bear, I think, some further elaboration to essentially this particular point of yours, Brian. One of the things that I've taken away from what the Chinese are doing now, Sean talked about their propaganda efforts to try to obscure the fact that they were in fact the source of this disease, that they were in fact responsible, the Chinese Communist Party, for it being vastly worse as a pandemic than it might otherwise have been through their lying and inaction. But also their efforts now increasingly, obviously, to cast themselves in a very different light than the perpetrators of this pandemic. Specifically, I've come to call it a narrative of communism is a cure for the coronavirus, which is to say that the kind of draconian steps that they've taken that have been applauded by the World Health Organization and that are now being, to varying degrees, emulated by some other governments, is the way to handle this disease. And they deserve great credit for having essentially brutally repressed their people and by so doing helped to flatten the curve, I guess, as you would say, Brian. Let's talk a little bit about both that rather ominous prospect and the sort of counterpart to it that I think you're touching on, Brian, and that is the propensity in this traumatic moment of many in the government, some in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, to sort of adopt, well, frankly, what might be called socialist, if not more draconian, even communist techniques to provide social safety nets and otherwise cushion the blow. What are the implications of that practice over time? I'd invite your thoughts.
Well, I think I would say about that, Frank, that we're in a pretty unprecedented time here. We wiped out $10 trillion from the stock market. That itself is unprecedented. We're ordering people to stay home from work. The casinos in Las Vegas are shut down. Hotels, tourism are shut down. Restaurants, bars, places where a lot of everyday Americans are making a living are shut down by order of our government. And so it's not crazy that the government has stepped in and tried to develop some kind of safety net for these people, because it wasn't their fault. This wasn't a normal occurrence. And so we do want to protect those people in those parts of the economy that are everyday working Americans who are going to suffer here. That having been said, we don't want to create socialism in the process. We don't want to do the kind of things that make us unemployed for long periods of time that require greater and greater government intervention, especially when we don't need to. And so I think taking the Chinese response, which was containment, we did do that, and it has, I think, had certain benefits. But we don't need to take the next step and try to create a centrally planned socialist economy in order to continue. I think we have to remember here too that America is a free people that can figure things out. And I think we will figure them out over time. And we need not panic about any of this.
Thanks. Brian, others of you, would you care to comment?
Can I add a few words?
Please.
Okay. So I think at the same time, the whole world need to question about the validity of Chinese government's effort to flatten the outbreak curves. So I think the Chinese government approach is draconian and also it disregard people's own privacy, interest, even their own life as well. We saw many reports saying people were just locked down in home and whole family died, and only after many days their body was discovered by the community. And the Chinese government shut down the whole city of Wuhan on January 23rd, but only have like 1 day or 2 days in preparation for this whole city shutdown. So you can imagine how much Wuhan people will suffer because of this sudden draconian measure that the Chinese government put on top of this large population of people, and how many people suffer, and how actually, and the measure was not really well planned out as well, and how many people got infected still running around between hospitals and further spreading the virus to more people. And so I think together with this draconian measure, actually Chinese government rely on covering the true situation, forbidden media report, for even now expiring foreign journalists, to do investigation report in Wuhan. They are covering this true situation in Wuhan. And at the same time, they're bragging about their efforts to the whole world, try to show their advantage as a socialist systems. So I think the whole world need to have a clear understanding the Chinese government not really doing a good job. We don't know how much humanitarian disasters actually was created by the government, and on top of this, epidemic in China. So I think this is really a false illusion the Chinese government been pushing out to the whole world. They say they are doing a good job. And right now it's even more dangerous for Chinese people, because the government actually now try to create another false illusion, saying we are now have total control of the epidemic. Now people can back to normal life, the factories can back to work, right? So even many of the overseas Chinese students try to go back to China, saying that the pandemic situation in the United States is actually getting more severe than China. So they are creating these whole illusions, but at the same time, actually they are incubating a big second wave of the outbreak in China. And we know many factories in China experience, cluster outbreak as well. And what is most worrisome is many of the cities in China start to secretly building those Fanchang hospitals, those temporary hospitals. So any people infected, they may ship them to these, temporary set up hospitals without enough medical support. So can create more people suffering from the infection, maybe more fatalities in this kind of facility. So I think this is really dangerous situation. So I don't think it's a model that the whole world should learn from it.
Amen. Rosemary or Gordon, any thoughts?
Well, Frank, I think what we're seeing here is just the nature of communism. You started with Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan's message is that the nature of the regime matters. And as Sean has pointed out, the initial reactions and the later reactions of Beijing to the coronavirus episode really spread the disease, which the secrecy, the rest of it, as well as we're seeing a flawed response now on the part of Beijing. We have seen Beijing try to take over the world and saying that their model is superior, when obviously it's not. It's attacked our society viciously. This is malign. This is the nature of a fragile communist state. And I think Xi Jinping right now must be at a point where he's thinking he has very few options. He's got a low threshold of risk. It means that he's going to lash out in some way, perhaps not the use of force, but he will do something that will destabilize the international system. And of course, as everyone has pointed out, China has one way or another spread this pathogen around the world, crippling societies. So that's the lesson that we must not forget.
Yeah, I would say he's destabilized the world so far with this project. Rosemary, any comment from you?
Yes. On the issue of transparency, it's been notable that an estimate of up to 2.2 million cases and maybe even deaths could occur here in the United States was put together by researchers in the UK. What's surprising is that if that would be the case here in the United States, why haven't we seen that level of outbreak and the population affected in China? So what I'm wonder about seeing that estimate that certainly put top leaders in this country on notice, are we overinflating things when we've had countries that have come before that haven't had that extent of harm to their populations? It's a little bit worrying, and I wonder if we're falling into the trap of becoming overly concerned based on estimates that are so out of proportion, unless, of course, China is truly hiding the level of cases and deaths that have occurred there.
Well, that's a distinct possibility, isn't it? Knowing the nature of that system. But Rosemary, your comment prompts another question, which is there is, of course, in addition to the Chinese Communist Party's activities and interests in all of this, the phenomenon of the sort of globalists, the people who are very keen to cultivate relationships with China, to do business with China, to migrate to China, factories, as you've discussed so well in China RX and here. But this larger globalist endeavor, this Event 201 that was held shortly before the pandemic burst out, involving a lot of the usual suspects in sort of the globalist elite, including the Davos folks, the World Economic Forum, Bloomberg's Johns Hopkins University programs, the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the United Nations Foundation, on and on, including, by the way, not only the US Center for Disease Control, but also the Chinese Centers for Disease Control. Their ambition in this exercise was very clearly stated. It was to use a coronavirus pandemic, no less, to build global governance, to make the case for more funding, which really goes to kind of the point that Brian was making a moment ago, that we're watching people, whether it's the Chinese for their purposes or the globalists for theirs, trying to advance a transformative agenda here that would leave us with a much diminished country in terms of our sovereignty and probably our freedoms as well. Is that something that you're seeing in your research, Rosemary?
I'll say, if there's ever a case for what some call nationalism, I call it just looking out for your own people, which we have a responsibility to do, and every government has a responsibility to do. If we have a global pandemic, a global government will not help countries. If we have concentration of global supply chains in a single country, that's devastating for more than 100 countries that will not have capacity to produce those things that they need to manage in a pandemic and save their lives of their people. So I think this whole coronavirus is actually showing us that we're on our own here, that we have to have self-sufficiency. Some may call that nationalism. I call it just common sense of having the capability to preserve and protect, almost self-quarantine. We're being called on to self-quarantine, which makes a lot of sense to prevent transmission of this disease. But we've also seen the need to self-quarantine when it comes to travel. If we look at the cases and where they came from and the reasons that there was a travel ban on China and then a travel ban on Italy, there's a reason for it. That's almost making the case that globalism doesn't work. We do have to take steps for the sake of our country, economically, from a health perspective, and frankly, our survivability. I think it's actually turned the tables on this notion that we're one world. One world will not help us when we're in a situation such as this.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Sean Lin, talk a little bit about, in this context, if you would, the role that's been played by the World Health Organization, one of these supranational entities that I think the globalists and to some extent the Chinese as well have been seeking to use as a vehicle for imposing, for example, just one very obvious example, this idea that it's the coronavirus 2019. It's not, in fact, the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus. What role is the WHO playing, Sean, and does it sort of reinforce concerns about the globalist agenda?
I think so. It's Chinese government's long-term strategy to heavily influence, even control many of these multinational large organizations, and WHO is one of them. And then they have, Margaret Chan to be in the leadership in the past, who is also from Hong Kong, but she has actually bad reputation from handling the SARS situations in Hong Kong poorly. but Chinese government support her, and then she became the Secretary General for WHO. And then now it's Dr. Tedros, and there are many reports talk about Chinese government, supporting him, his election as a leadership for the WHO. And recently we see the Chinese government even further donate another $500 million to WHO, just kind of buying the WHO support as well. And WHO being kind of working cohort with the Chinese government to present a wrong information to the whole world. And because when Chinese government covered that information, WHO didn't insist on sending independent team into China to investigate the true situation. And US CDC actually on January 3rd already sent out a request to go to China to send a small team in China, but Chinese government rejected. And eventually, when at the end of February, when the Chinese government finally admitted, allowed WHO experts to go into China, it was actually a joint mission. So basically half of the team were from China, and then with some experts from European country and 2 from United States. But throughout their almost 2 weeks mission, only 1 day was in Wuhan, and even not the whole team. Only selected member of the team can go into Wuhan. So of course, the information that they got is what the Chinese government want the whole world to see. It's a couple of missions. So it's really sad that WHO even agreed to do this kind of mission, because you cannot find a true situation in China. And when WHO tried to have the new name, COVID-19, it got a lot of criticisms too. And because it's hard to pronounce, but also it didn't show the origin of the virus. I think the Chinese government insisted not to call it SARS too, and because it's SARS related, SARS like coronavirus, right? So even though the virus now is named as SARS-CoV-2, but the disease, the Chinese government still doesn't want to call it, and create a new name, COVID-19. It's even a worse name than a SARS. At least SARS is a severe acute respiratory symptom, right? So, and the Chinese government don't want to call the Wuhan virus. So the WHO kind of all work along with the Chinese government, and very sadly, they actually rejected Taiwan to join the WHO. So this is another terrible mistake. So I think a lot of stigma on WHO, and Taiwan government actually did very good. Actually, one suggestion I want to present to U.S. administration or the White House task force is actually they need to look into the antibody-based testing that Taiwan has really established. It's a very convenient testing. It's like dipstick styles antibody testing. It's very convenient, so it can reduce the testing time down to 15 minutes. They're very convenient for drive-through as well. So I think U.S. White House task force need to check with the Taiwanese government, maybe try to get this kind of testing as soon as possible. Yeah.
Good point. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add anything, Gordon or Brian?
The one thing that we're seeing here, I think, is the end of globalism, because it just hasn't worked, Frank. As Rosemary's pointed out, this disease was carried by travelers. We're seeing that what we have to do is become self-sufficient. That is directly antithetical to this notion of one world. And as Sean pointed out, the World Health Organization has become useless. So when we put all these things together, we have to understand that America needs to defend its sovereignty, needs to be self-sufficient. And this is the president's message. He's been consistent on this during his campaign. It was the theme of his inaugural address. We've heard him talk about it at his UN General Assembly speeches. And this is the way the world's going. It is not just the United States now. We are seeing these same themes in other societies because they just make sense. And so for all of us, it's going to be, I think, a very different world going forward. We are challenging all these global notions, and we're going to have a different system. I'm not saying it's going to be a better system, but it's going to be, I think, a very different world as we peer out after the coronavirus subsides.
Brian Kennedy, any thoughts?
I would add to that, Frank, that the World Health Organization has discredited itself with this entire effort it's put forth. It turns out not to be so much a health organization as simply a political organization. And a lot of people will wonder, well, why would the World Health Organization have a political agenda? Well, if you look at the Director General, Dr. Tedros, he's a Maoist from Ethiopia who's part of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. That seems like an odd thing for a Director General of the WHO to be part of, but politically he's a very radical guy, and his sympathies lie with the communist Chinese, not with the world. And so he's taken a very political tact here, much to, I think, discredit the WHO overall. And as Gordon suggests, we're going to have to rely on ourselves as Americans, building American institutions, and as Rosemary says, building the kind of medical and pharmaceutical infrastructure so we don't have to rely on the rest of the world. And again, that just seems like common sense.
Yeah. Similarly, Brian, common sense argues that we should not be underwriting this regime. We've talked about supply chains, of course, but one of the other very important elements of the engagement policy of the United States, again, under successive Republican as well as Democratic administrations, has been to encourage the capital markets of this country to include Chinese companies that don't meet the same standards for transparency or accountability or governance, let alone material risk disclosure, that are required of American companies. And yet they're getting access to investments, particularly institutional investments from, among others, public pension funds in this country. We've taken this show on the road in the weeks before the coronavirus set in to 9 different states to basically convey the Committee on the Present Danger of China's message that this is ill-advised from a national security point of view, such investments in China. It's also a fiduciarily unsound approach as well. And we found that a lot of people, particularly in a poll that we conducted back at the end of January for the Committee on the Present Danger of China. All of this is available at our website, presentdangerchina.org. But the poll made it very clear. The public was deeply skeptical to and skeptical about and opposed to the idea of having our investment dollars flowing to particularly malevolent Chinese companies, to say nothing of ones that are simply fraudulent or unsound financially. So I'd ask the question, I guess, of each of you. There's talk now about reparations of some kind for the kind of damage that the Chinese flu has done to our economy. But it does seem to me, again, going back to your point about common sense, Brian Kennedy, that at a minimum, we need to stop the hemorrhage of funds, let alone expanding it by bringing in the resources of pensioners in the federal thrift savings plan, which is now impending. If everything else is equal, we may well see military servicemen and women and other federal government employees, past and present, having to put their future financial security in such Chinese companies. And I would just invite each of you to sort of address these questions about, are there other things that we can be doing, such as ending this kind of sweetheart arrangement with the various Chinese Communist Party's companies in our markets, to try to, again, further enhance our sovereign, independent security, and deprive the Chinese of the wherewithal to threaten all of the above. Frank,
I think one opportunity we have is to help explain this in concrete terms, what's happening. So I started talking about how at least $6 billion of Americans' money is going to China every year to buy their drugs that they're making for the United States as our manufacturing is collapsing. The public can understand that. And I think we have an opportunity to translate these deep concerns about the flows of capital into ways that the average person can see this, we've got to stop this.
I couldn't agree more, Rosemary. And you know, patriotic investing, among other things, in you know, relocating those supply chains, getting those manufacturing capabilities for medicine, among other things, back in this country would seem to me to be a very important alternative. Brian or Gordon, Sean, any thoughts?
Well, Frank, I think we're going to see a very different relationship with China going forward. And it's going to be a much reduced relationship. And part of it is going to be the hostility that China has shown to the United States at a time of, you know, are going through this epidemic. That's going to enrage Americans. And we've seen some, you know, conversation along those lines. So we're going to have, I think, first of all, much more self-sufficient industry. In those areas that we're going to see that executive order from the president on pharmaceuticals. We're probably going to see much less buying of electronic products from the Chinese. As you point out, we're not going to be investing in the Chinese markets. And it's not just going to be the federal pension funds. I think we may see prohibitions or restrictions on investments by private businesses into China. Across the board, there will be much less activity. And one thing to sort of highlight this, President Trump, of course, is very proud of his phase 1 trade deal with China signed January 15th. Beijing has been hinting for more than a month now, but especially in the last couple days, that it is not able to go forward on its core commitment to the United States, which is to buy an additional $200 billion of goods and services over the 2017 base in a 2-year period. You know, President Trump talks about this all the time. China wants out. A lot of people initially are going to say that's, oh yeah, why should we force them to honor that obligation when they're going through an epidemic? But you got to remember that, as Sean pointed out, China knew about the severity of the coronavirus outbreak when it signed this deal on January 15th. And indeed, it sent its officials into the East Room of the White House, where there was much of the American leadership. And each of those Chinese officials were a potential disease carrier. Mm-hmm. So I don't think China should get any break at all. And if China doesn't want to honor its obligations, we should just increase the tariffs on Chinese goods. That will be beneficial generally, because it means we will be looking towards other places, including our own borders, to manufacture goods.
Well, I very much hope that the president will resist the temptation to try to plunge in and save China, and perhaps that trade deal by pushing more money their way. It seems to me the kinds of changes you're talking about are certainly needed. Sean Lind, any thoughts from you on this closing comment?
Yes. I also want to echo what Gordon said. You know, it's definitely we need to stop underwriting them, and also it's more than just a strict safety plan. I think we need to also enforce the regulation that Chinese government, Chinese companies need to be transparent on their accountings. Before they can even get on the U.S. market. And so many major Chinese companies already in the U.S. market through their, third-party identities in those islands, the tax havens. And so I think this part, we need to make sure the Chinese company need to fully expose their financial details to the whole world before we can even, invest in these kind of companies. So I think that's also one of the main channels the Chinese government pulled money from the whole world. So I think this part we need to change our current practice. And at the same time, I think we also need to be aware the Chinese government is also definitely at a critical point, as Gordon mentioned. So they are very vulnerable. So they try to shift the blame to the whole world. So they don't mind the whole world's economy collapse, because if the Chinese economy collapse in the backdrop, the whole world's recess, they can shift the blame to the whole world. And the Chinese government can tell Chinese people, say, we didn't do a good job, but you can see the whole world is not doing a good job. So they try to hold on to their power. So the fundamental issue for the Chinese Communist Party is still how they can grip to their own power. They don't care how much Chinese people suffer, how much the whole world suffers in this process. So I think it's really a false hope to try to engage China to underwriting their own financial system as well.
Amen. Brian Kennedy, let me give you the last word, if I may.
Well, thank you, Frank. Really to everyone's point, life goes on, and we should hold China to account when it comes to phase one of the trade deal. While we're in the middle of this crisis, they continue to engage in the theft of our intellectual property. And they continue to do all sorts of bad things economically to the United States. And so we should hold them to account. And I'm not so sure I agree with Gordon when it comes to the other parts about us investing, the United States investing in China. I think there still will be a very big push by a lot of the so-called globalists on Wall Street to get the United States working with and investing in communist China. I think even with this crisis, that's not abated. And I wouldn't be surprised if many people, even some in the administration and the Treasury Department, who have been more globalist advocates, continue to push on that. Now, I think Gordon is right that the American people will sensibly not want to be putting their hard-earned dollars in communist China. But the good common sense of the American people, I will trust far more than the globalists on Wall Street, I will say. And so we have a lot to do to educate Americans about this. And I think over time, we're going to continue to do so. And I'm confident that the American people are going to rally here to a common sense solution to this coronavirus crisis. So, but let me thank you, Frank, for all you've done here to organize this and to keep pushing this forward.
Well, thank you, Brian Kennedy. This is, of course, the purpose of the Committee on the Present Danger of China is to try to engage in precisely that kind of education and really to bring home to our countrymen and women just how central the kind of information that we've been sharing is to the decisions that will be made in this fall, assuming we still have an election this fall, and I assume we will. It's arguably the single most important topic of that election. John McLaughlin, the pollster who did the poll for the Committee on the Present Danger, said this is the sleeper issue of the 2020 election. I think all of that was before the coronavirus sprung forth as it has. I think he would agree now it's not just a sleeper issue, it is front and center, and hopefully the kind of information that Dr. Sean Lin, Rosemary Gibson, Gordon Chang, and Brian Kennedy have shared with you all today will be helpful to you in thinking through both the nature of the challenge that we're facing, the present, as we say, and growing danger from communist China, but also how we proceed as a people to protect our freedoms and to assure that we defeat this generation's existential threat to that freedom. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for the help that I hope you will be providing us in protecting our country against the threat from communist China and its Chinese Communist Party. Thank you for listening.